RPG Maker games have always carried a stigma for being terrible products for the most part, mainly due to mechanical limitations and poor optimization. Any game from this engine that has had critical acclaim was mainly derived from presentation and overall writing quality. While that may seem easy on paper, it takes an extremely well-written and designed game to overcome the limitations of its game engine. With that out of the way, let's review Lisa. As previously implied, Lisa is an RPG Maker game set in a post-apocalyptic setting. The game covers the story of a nobody named Brad who stumbles upon a baby. Upon realizing that this baby is the last woman on Earth, Brad takes it upon himself to keep her safe from the hordes of people that would want to exploit this situation. After years of keeping the young girl safe, the secret's out and suddenly hundreds of perverts are out hunting this child for the hope of restoring humanity. From there, the story starts as Brad tries to save his surrogate daughter from the evils of mankind. Many of the themes and ideas from Lisa are actually carried over from Dingaling's previous freeware RPG Maker game, retroactively named Lisa the First. While some of the elements from the first appear in Lisa, playing that game isn't necessary to understand the overall plot, they are only tangentially related. The gameplay for Lisa is somewhat run-of-the-mill. The game plays out on a 2D plane in the overworld as you explore the obliterated wastelands that people consider the last bastion of humanity. There's some platforming in the overworld, but it's less a challenge and more a means to flesh out the environment or display some comedic situations. Combat is done through classic turn-based style where you input commands in a menu and watch them unfold. The combat has some depth, however. Brad and certain allies are able to input combos to pull off special techniques during an attack, rewarding players that take the time to memorize these combos with extra damage. For the most part, Lisa's gameplay is very vanilla initially and tends to play like classic turn-based RPGs like Dragon Warrior. One thing Lisa does to tie together gameplay elements and story segments together is making choices relevant. Now when I say relevant, I don't mean you are now down X story path. I mean your choices will affect how you play the game from a gameplay standard. This was a huge selling point for the game and it shows in many different ways. Many sections of the game force players to make a huge decision, one of which being to choose between sacrificing a party member or a piece of Brad, like his arm. This decision has huge implications for the player, since it's a choice between keeping your overall party strong or keeping the one permanent member of the party physically able and competent. These choices often vary in nature and occur quite frequently, so each playthrough has a personal connection with the players themselves. There are even optional scenarios that let you make drastic decisions, the big one being a Russian roulette minigame where players use their characters' lives as gambling fodder. This all really hammers home the dire nature of the story and how utterly hopeless this world is. That being said, the story for Lisa is probably the game's biggest draw and greatest asset. I've always felt that most post-apocalyptic games are way too optimistic, and it seems like the developer of Lisa had the same mindset I had. As players progress through the game, they begin to see how disgusting humanity really is as hordes of various factions try to capture Brad's adopted daughter. This is also complemented by the game's morbid sense of humor, with scenes such as being rewarded for elbow-dropping a random asshole, Power Rangers that can't seem to get their act together, and the unusually detailed life story of one random construction worker. There's also always a slight feeling that not everything in the story is as it seems, which keeps the player uneasy and always guessing what happens next. Oddly enough, the presentation of the game directly contrasts the dark plot. The visual design direction is all very colorful and is fairly reminiscent of Earthbound's art style. And many of the musical scores all have a sort of invigorating energy to them. Despite this contrast, none of the visuals or music clash with the game's theme and even serve to act as a foil to catch players off guard when the story advances. It's somewhat hard to convey every facet of the story without going into spoiler territory, but Lisa does a great job of using its assets to weave an engrossing and mortifying tale to the player. The game engine for Lisa, however, can cause some frustrations with the player. As I mentioned at the start of this review, Lisa was built in RPG Maker, and this causes a wide array of problems. I won't go into heavy technical details, but I will say that a pizza box could run this game easily. That, however, is probably the best part of Lisa's game engine. The The game has keyboard controls and full controller support, but you have to bind controller keys by pressing F1 in-game, so there's some setup required. There's also some issues with the legacy build's keybinds due to none of the listings correlating to things in-game, but there's a text document for that, so there's some help. The full screen and windowed options are toggled through Alt and Enter. However, windowed mode has no resolution options, so the size is changed through stretching the window rather than having manual functions. Sadly, the game's sprites don't take well to upscaling either, with sprites getting distorted and text getting cut off when you stretch the windowed mode. Finally, there's some weird framerate issues with the game in certain areas. In the game's initial release, there were some huge frame skips in various zones, but for the most part that was patched out. Now, however, certain early game areas seem to freeze the game visually when you climb a ladder. While the latter happens very rarely early on, it's still fairly noticeable and may confuse the player. I'm pretty sure there were reasons as to why the developer used RPG Maker for the game, but the flaws of the engine really stand out. Lisa is a game that proves that the tools used in game development don't define the experience of a game. Despite using a really poor game engine, Dingaling made a game that evoked so many raw emotions out of me. The game is most certainly not for everyone considering its content, but if you're willing to take a risk, then I can guarantee you will have a chilling experience with Lisa.